Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story: The End of the War Against Terrorism. Professor Lauren Head shifted in her seat, wondering who had designed something so uncomfortable. They shouldn't sell seats that weren't fit for purpose, she thought, even to politicians. But maybe her discomfort was largely psychological. Certainly she felt unpleasantly distanced from the oak-panelled tranquillity of her rooms in Oxford. Moreover, she didn't much like the person she had been brought to see. But then, not many people did. "Prime Minister," she sighed. "Do call me Derek," the Prime Minister interrupted irritably. "Prime Minister," Lauren insisted, "just because I am an expert in the English language does not give me the right to redefine words on a whim." "Words change their meaning all the time," argued the Prime Minister. "Words change their meaning because of the gradual and inevitable pressure of public usage, not because some professor rewrites the dictionary entry," she explained. She didn't attempt to conceal the bitterness from her voice. If she had disliked Prime Minister Derek Smawk before being dragged to London, she positively loathed the man now. It has to be said, Derek Smawk was an easy man to loathe. A squat figure with a pinched face, his track record prior to election had shown him entirely unsuited to the role of a public servant. Lazy, incompetent, and a congenital liar, his all-round unattractiveness was matched by a kind of bullish incoherence when he spoke in public, as if he didn't really think his audience merited the effort to make actual sense. The only thing that gave him any appeal at all was that he had, in the course of his career, managed to insult pretty much every conceivable group of people. This meant that anyone inclined to see their enemy's enemy as their friend could find plenty of examples of his being their friend, even if it meant actively ignoring the times when he had demonstrably been their enemy. He had therefore built up a following amongst those willing to match any given prejudice with equivalent levels of self-deception. This applied to a depressing number of people. Even so, it was hardly enough to make him a serious prospect in terms of electability, which was how he wanted it, since his political career was primarily a scheme to get rich quick via a profit-driven start-up masquerading as a populist political party. His plan to find candidates for every constituency by making people pay for the privilege of standing was an extremely stupid idea that just happened to turn out to be a clever one, because it played to a particular kind of vanity that assumed that paying for a thing bestowed it with a higher status. In the end, it hardly mattered whether they lost their deposits, because he was already in profit, and the kind of person willing to buy their way into a party's candidacy also turned out to be the kind of person who generated a lot of publicity through sheer self-importance. If a few of his candidates did embarrassing things like embezzle money or quote Mussolini, or turn out not to be real people at all, then it was still publicity, after all. Being unelectable puts a party in a position of absolutely no responsibility at all, enabling them to make all kinds of promises that need never be tested. What had ultimately tipped the balance of the election was Smawk's outspoken and groundless declaration on some chat show or other that if he were in charge, he would end the war against terrorism. What he hadn't anticipated was that a series of unsuccessful but potentially catastrophic attempted car bombings by a small terrorist group fighting for the liberation of Cornwall from their English oppressors would put the whole country into a state of sustained panic. If Scotland was allowed its own laws, they argued, Cornwall should be allowed some too, and they would not cease their campaign until their demands were met. And one day, experts predicted, they would certainly work out how to wire up a car bomb so the thing actually worked. After decades of terrorist activity from one group or another, the British people had finally had enough. Regardless of the political sophistication, or otherwise, of the perpetrators, people needed to feel secure. Derek Smawk might have seemed an unlikely saviour, lacking as he was in personality or any notable skills. but the clip of him promising to end the war against terrorism gained traction as the election loomed closer, and being a man for whom saying things and consequences had never been bedfellows, he doubled down and repeated the boast. His party's candidates, having absolutely no ideas of their own, also repeated it. Nobody else was promising to end the war against terrorism, because everybody else running for election had a clear sense of the responsibility that must accompany any such unlikely claims. So it was that, riding a wave of slogans such as "Let's get this war done," "A future without fear," and "Take terror to the terrorists," Smawk and a pundit-defying significant majority floated to an improbable victory on the back of their rash assurances. Victory against the terrorists was not going to come so easily. In the initial months following his election, Smawk's strategy had simply been to continue to attack the problem with slogans. Confident, albeit meaningless, statements about split-second security and pre-cooked protection made it easy for everyone who had voted for him to ignore his failure to do anything and claim that he was exactly the person the country needed at this moment of crisis. As time wore on, even his most enthusiastic supporters began to realise that they were still afraid, indeed terrified, and that especially since Smawk's negligence was starting to impact the quality of public services and bring the economy to a grinding halt, they were, if anything, a little more frightened than they had been before. Meanwhile, the Cornish terrorists continued to almost successfully explode cars, and even Smawk realised he needed to do something to make good his words. After 4.5 years in power, he had finally concluded that this was going to be all but impossible. Of course, politicians are rarely bound by their promises, prime ministers especially, but in this respect Smawk was a casualty of his pre-election cockiness. Not only had he essentially failed to talk about anything else, but he had also given a number of interviews complacently declaring that if the war against terrorism hadn't ended before his first term was out, he would definitely resign. These interviews had become decidedly convenient to an opposition who had realised that Smawk wasn't up to much as a prime minister, a media who increasingly agreed with them, an electorate who agreed with whatever the media told them, and a party who were starting to worry that Smawk's growing unpopularity threatened the profits that had been their main reason for going into this whole thing in the first place. Hardly a day passed when he wasn't taunted with footage of his own stupid mouth opening and closing with words that guaranteed the end of his political career in around 6 months' time. His latest ploy was to try to redefine the word war to make it easier to bring about any kind of resolution to this one, but Professor Head, a leading figure in the development and use of the English language, was telling him now that the power to change the meaning of words is simply not vested in me. She glared at the Prime Minister and spitefully added, "I'm pretty sure it isn't vested in you either." Derek Smawk didn't like the Professor's attitude, and was beginning to wonder if sufficient power was vested in him to have the woman locked away as a traitor, especially as she had rebutted his attempts to make a pass at her so shamelessly, which was just rude when the person making a pass at you was the Prime Minister. "Now hang on," Smawk said. "I'm not asking you to rewrite the definition for crying out loud. I'm asking you if there is an existing interpretation of the word that might... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Make my problem easier to solve," he finished, looking pointedly at the Professor. But the Professor was already of the opinion that the Prime Minister had misused the word in the first place, given the necessarily two-sided nature of conflicts, and the essentially one-sided nature of terrorism. If the word war was being employed in the more general sense of a campaign to end something, then the Prime Minister had chosen it even more unwisely, given the impossibility of putting an end to hostilities led by such an ill-defined group of antagonists. Smawk had rehearsed the problem many times in front of his political adviser, one Fleur de Mille, who was the only person left in Downing Street who would still listen to him. All the civil servants, the spin doctors, and the once sycophantic members of his own party had long sensed an oncoming change of leadership and scurried off like rats in search of a better-made ship. Fleur had attempted to scurry off with them, but since Fleur's only qualification for her role had been to lip-sync to a self-penned song about Derek Smawk in a TikTok video, nobody else would have her. She was beginning to regret having made the video in the first place, but with no idea what else she might do as a career, she meekly stuck around, continuing to offer advice from her position of complete ignorance. It wasn't even as though her song about the Prime Minister had been at all political. It had been built around a list of qualities which, now she was in his employ, she knew she had completely imagined, so she considered it particularly unfair that she was now the default punchbag for his self-inflicted angst. "I reckon that's the trouble with democracy," she sadly responded when Smawk reported back on his fruitless conversation with the professor. "If you don't give people what they want, sooner or later they decide they don't want you either."
"Balderdash!" snapped Smawk. "It's not about giving people what they want. It's not even about giving people what they think they want. You only have to make them think you've given them what they think they want. Problem is, now they've had a chance to think about it some more, they've started to think that I never gave them what they wanted in the first place."
"Hardly your fault, is it?" Fleur suggested.
"If it was an ordinary war," Smawk continued, "it would be easy. I'd get the leader of whoever we were fighting into a room, we'd have a few drinks, I'd offer a few concessions, we'd shake hands and peace would reign."
He paced the length of his office.
"That isn't possible with terrorists. Who would I get into the room? They're not organised enough to have a leader. They all just go at it as and when they please. I don't even know how we're supposed to communicate with them. They've not left us a phone number."
"Is there a return address for those grainy videos they post to issue threats?" Fleur asked. Smawk, who was completing a lap of his desk, slammed his fist down on its surface without warning.
"The videos!" he exploded. "They say it all, don't they? Why the hell are they still using video? Do you have any idea how long it took MI5 to track down a working VHS player? It'd serve them right if nobody even saw their bloody messages."
"Perhaps they think video looks more sinister," suggested Fleur. She was something of a connoisseur of 80s horror films, and her personal view was that nothing could recreate the sense of creeping, hissing, wobbly, liney horror that you got with video.
"Sinister? It looks like it's been recorded through a heavy downpour of shit," the Prime Minister colourfully declared. "Don't they know you can pick up a perfectly decent digital camera for £10 these days?"
"Maybe it's because they're in Cornwall," posited Fleur.
"It's because they're a bloody shambles," reiterated Smawk. "It's no wonder I can't make peace with them. It's their fault, not mine."
"I reckon being a shambles is one of their ways of creating terror," said Fleur, to whom a drawer of clothes that hadn't been KonMari'd and catalogued by colour was as nightmarish as an 80s horror film, if less enjoyable. But Smawk wasn't listening.
"If I can't speak to their leader," he was musing, "and let's face it, I can't get every single one of them into a room to negotiate, perhaps a representative terrorist would do for the lot of them."
"Oh yeah, you could make an official peace, couldn't you?" agreed Fleur, "even if the other terrorists chose to ignore it."
"Right," said Smawk, "and nobody could blame me for that."
So he set about finding a representative terrorist with whom to negotiate. The ideal candidate presented himself in the form of Stephen Repton, founder member of a small organisation called Save My Arts. Having been refused funding for a PhD in music in spite of achieving an outstanding double first from a highly regarded red brick university, Repton had decided that the government needed to be called to account for its flagrant disregard for the arts and humanities when it came to the national budget. Being an out-of-work musician, he had the advantage of week upon week of empty days in which to plot and put into action dramatic demonstrations for his cause. Most recently, he had arranged for thousands of percussionists to take woodblocks onto the London Underground and spend an entire day performing works by Philip Glass to the commuters and tourists.
"And if that isn't terrorism," said Smawk, "then I don't know what is."
The Prime Minister was dismayed to learn from the Chancellor of the Exchequer that there was no money available to make concessions to any musician, since after 4.5 years of not really knowing how to budget for a country, there was precious little money available for anything, and what was left was already earmarked for an inquiry into wasteful government spending. In the unlikely event that money was left over, the Chancellor explained, it would be needed for defence. He was not to be swayed by Smawk's hopeful argument that arts funding could come from the defence budget, since it would, after all, end the war against terrorism. "People want to see something for their money," the Chancellor insisted. "They're not going to understand if we spend it on the arts, which everyone knows are free already." Smawk had no choice but to consider which concessions he might make to the person who ran Save My Arts, other than actually saving their arts. He found the solution in a more traditional approach. "To bring an end to our feud," Smawk told Repton, "and to show the world that from now on we will be working together, I'm prepared to offer you my daughter's hand in marriage." Repton frowned.
"You're not prepared to make any changes to the level of arts funding?"
he persisted. "It's a very complex issue," Smawk explained vaguely. "Of course," he hastily added, "as my son-in-law you could certainly expect my personal support for any financial needs as far as your PhD was concerned." Repton frowned again, and took a gulp of the 1787 Chateau de Cam they were drinking, the cost of which would have paid for 15 music PhDs, and considered the offer. He wasn't really the marrying type. On the other hand, he had grown weary of organising demonstrations when all he really wanted to do was a PhD, and a wife would make his parents happy.
"What's she like?"
he asked. "Not especially attractive," Smawk admitted, "but she's quiet." So it was that Prime Minister Smawk appeared on the cover of every newspaper the next morning, grinning broadly and holding hands with his daughter on one side and her fiancé on the other, and declaring that the war against terrorism was over. "This marriage," he announced, "seals a future in which the British people will no longer fight terrorists, but will work with them, side by side, to make a better world." The voters were impressed. Suddenly, Smawk was a hero. The civil servants and the spin doctors came scurrying back, and his own party members were immediately desperate to renew their devotion, which he was happy for them to do, as long as they were happy to pay for the privilege of standing for him again. Aided by a period of relative domestic peace, and a few slogans based around the idea that in his next term as Prime Minister he would make Britain rich again, he effortlessly flew to a second election victory. 4 days later, the Cornish People's Liberation Front succeeded in crashing a Honda Civic loaded with gelignite into the Scottish Parliament, blowing up half of the building and killing 107 people, an action explained in a grainy video of a burly Cornishman angrily shouting that if Cornwall wasn't allowed its own assembly, then Scotland couldn't have one either. The United Kingdom demanded answers, and the Prime Minister was naturally called to account. "This was not an act of terrorism," he told the world at a special press conference, a statement confirmed by Stephen Repton, now his son-in-law, who had been hastily unearthed from his thesis on Shostakovich to condemn the attack on behalf of all terrorists. Professor Lauren Head was reluctantly dragged from her rooms in Oxford and driven to an emergency meeting at Downing Street. A few days later, Smawk made a second announcement. "The attack," he said with a sad, serious expression, "was carried out by activists. Since we cannot allow our country to be intimidated in this way, I have no choice but to declare that we are now at war with activism." Distressing though the news was, a ray of hope came in the form of a message from the Cornish activist leader indicating that he was prepared to negotiate with the Prime Minister. Willing as ever to find a peaceful solution, Smawk duly ordered another bottle of Chateau de Cam and arranged a meeting. "You must understand," he told the Cornish activist leader, "that these are very complex issues." "Exactly," nodded the Cornish activist leader. "Very complex harm." He shifted in his improbably uncomfortable seat. He felt unpleasantly distanced from the homespun simplicity of his cottage in Cornwall. Moreover, he didn't much like the person he had come to see. But then, that was hardly the point. "Well," he said nervously, giving the Prime Minister an edgy smile. Then he leaned forward and rested his shaking hands on the table, ready for business. "All right," he began. Smawk nodded encouragingly, and the Cornish activist leader cleared his throat. Finally, he spoke again, a sheepish look on his face. "You got any more daughters?" he inquired. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature. And if you want to know more about me and my work, you can find me on Blue Sky as James Lark and on Instagram as Works of Lark. Also, I would be really grateful if you could tell people about this podcast, spread the word and get more people listening to it, whether it's your friends, your family, your colleagues. Stick it on in the background of a party, put it on in the car, play it loudly on public transport. You know, everyone will thank you. Probably.